Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming this evening on such a beautiful night out after the torrential rains we had this afternoon. At least at my house we did. I thought we were going through another eclipse. As a matter of fact, it was darker than the eclipse, which was kind of strange, but nonetheless. The committee notes that we had from our last meeting of July 26th. Hopefully you've had an opportunity to review those. And are there any suggested changes or amendments or anything we need to discuss? Or can we approve them as submitted? Yes, ma'am.
Okay. We're talking about the notes here. Just looking at it was mentioned on page 2 under my comments about number 60, but then number 60 was not mentioned in the list. So I just wanted to... because I thought you were going down all the ones that were in red.
We were, but we had already talked about 60, we didn't bring it up again, but we can add
okay, I just wanted to make sure, that's the comment I just made. It was mentioned under a statement I made, but I wanted just to make sure it was part of that list.
Okay, noted. Anybody else?
So, as part of your packets you received tonight, you should have had a new revised draft dated 8/23. I don't know these are not. It says big draft on the front of it. This is the zoning framework that we saw from last meeting, and based on your comments on some staff review of it, we've considered some changes, which I'm going to briefly go through here. So, if you can kind of look through, the first changes occur on page 6, and the changes from your previous meeting are striked through in red, and then the changes that have been made since are highlighted in yellow. So the highlighted in yellow is what we're going to go over today. So the first one you see is a bullet under replace existing districts. This was in the previous draft. But we just kind of reworded it a little bit. Originally we weren't going to include these at all and just kind of refine the language, but we'd like to sort of incorporate some of the language of the zoning districts we've been proposing into these districts as well. So we're kind of just alluding to the fact that that will happen when the zoning code comes out. The next change is under the reviewed allowed uses, and we thought we would just include a few bullet points to show, that we're encouraging mixed use, and this is based on, today's market, and to create vibrant, walkable places. That's kind of the goal of the project. So we wanted to sort of include that somewhere, and so we put a few bullets for that language in there. So next is the district framework on the next page 7. So as we discussed last time, a few things I want to point out. The boutique hotel was stricken out, and we just have a category for hotel now under the uses. We had gotten rid of traditional low scale 3 last time, but we added the suburban low scale 2.5, which, as you went through the table last meeting, you had labeled about 5 or 6 of those into that category. And so we've kind of included that, and it looks similar to the traditional, but it has pretty much the suburban form. Yeah.
Shouldn't there be a circle under the hotel category where it was stricken under the boutique hotel column? Should we add a circle under
For suburban,
suburban?
medium scale 4.
Yeah.
Right, because it's being stricken from boutique hotel. But I think you're saying the committee would still like it allowed in that district? Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's just really slow. I can get to them through
Yeah, we
my email.
did add, my notes indicate that we were striking boutique and adding hotel.
Okay.
There was a gap there under suburban for boutique hotels.
Okay, when he got rid of the category, he probably just crossed them all out, but didn't transfer them over to the hotel. Okay. Sure.
I don't know if we have the images with us or not, so I don't know if you can pull those up.
You just keep talking. I'll try to pull.
After the meeting, last meeting, Lee wrote and said that he perhaps didn't give an ample description of what a boutique hotel is. And with all due respect, Dave, I think you referred to the Reichert House as a boutique hotel, and I think that probably left an impression in people's minds of what that is. He didn't do anything to refute that or contradict that, but he sent some photographs of examples of boutique hotels from other places, and I think it's not the same as what the Reichert House is. Certainly, it's smaller scale. It's more integrated into the neighborhoods, and I would just be remiss if we didn't show these images, let you take a look at them, understand that that's the concept that he considers to be a boutique hotel, and then see what you think about that. I don't know if we can pull those.
It's really
pull them
slow.
up.
It's really slow.
Yeah, it's a little slow to do. You're pulling up your email, right?
Yeah.
So we got a ways to go.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's about
All right.
2 minutes.
Well, why don't we continue on? Well, you're doing that. We'll continue down the table because any other questions? I guess we got through the low scale nodes, right? And we're into the medium scale nodes and the corrections that Carl noted. You'll also notice on the right-hand side, they've introduced the idea of frontages. These are the frontage types that we've talked about in the past. They're illustrated on page 9. And I think these are here more to suggest that, one, we can introduce the idea of frontage types to the code, and then to give a kind of a preview of what frontage types might be associated with the different districts that are outlined here. Lori, the conversation that we had with Kevin this afternoon, what did we decide to do with these? We're just kind of leaving them here kind of as an example for conversation, right?
Right, so these are kind of what we're thinking would fall into the different zoning categories. And so this just gives everybody a general idea of these types of frontages, and then as we go forward with the zoning code, these would be hashed out a lot more detailed. So this kind of just shows what would correspond with those proposed zoning districts.
And we'll talk a little bit more about the frontages when we get to the next page. Okay, so these are the images that Lee provided for what he would call as examples of boutique hotels. More of an urban setting. In some cases, fitting within city blocks, maybe some conversions of houses. But this is what he was referring to as boutique hotels. So I show you these just to kind of give you those examples and do due diligence with his comments. I don't know whether this would prompt you to reconsider the idea of boutique hotels and the difference between hotel and boutique hotel. I think that was the crux of the argument last time. What's the difference? A hotel is a hotel is a hotel. I think his argument is it's probably not. And these kinds of things could be permitted in places where you might not want the more suburban style or larger scale hotels. So I don't know if there's any comments or thoughts on that. Just open that up for a little discussion.
I think you'll have to then define, for all purposes of our plan, what a boutique hotel is, because the definition of boutique hotel in the industry is fairly broad. Some will say it's between 10 and 100 rooms, but 100 rooms in Chicago is small, 100 rooms in downtown Amherst is big. So I think you have to define, for the purpose of this, I can't just leave the term boutique hotels without trying to define its applicability to our context. That would be my point, if you want to reintroduce it at all.
And I would just add to that, given the pictures that are representative of what Lee is talking about, if we want to re-add the concept of a boutique hotel, we might want to allow it in some of the medium and low-scale node categories, since they are smaller and they, could be 3 stories or less.
Do we, given those comments, I don't know if there's a general feeling as to whether or not you want to reconsider that as a use, or are we just opposed to that altogether? And I'm going to hand the microphone to the chair so he can do what he does.
Further discussion?
Yeah, if I could, to me, boutique is the service that's being provided. It's a hotel with a certain type of service. And the rest of the hotels are more the traditional, Holiday Inn type of hotel, or any of the other major Marriotts, etc. I think the real issue to me with the hotel is, do you want some kind of hotel, I don't care what type of hotel it is, or service, in an area? And I think that making difference between the two types, to me, doesn't make a difference. It's whether you want a lodging type of facility in a particular area.
In some respects, it's not different than having a plaza that's got branded retail and a plaza that's got, locally owned independent retailers, right? Boutique hotel is basically an independently operated, non-franchised hotel. It's got unique design style that's not necessarily bound to a franchise requirement, but it's a hotel. So, maybe the Swarmsville Station could be a boutique hotel because it's small, it's quaint, it's cute, and it fits there, but you want to put a, 4-story, 80-room Hampton in there. I think it's context.
Yeah, it's a better scale. A branded hotel, in your experience, both of your experiences, how small will they let you build a branded hotel? Rooms.
It's a fully branded hotel versus like Record House is a tribute collection hotel, which means it's a boutique hotel, but it's in a collection, but it's independent.
Oh, Marriott.
But a branded hotel, really depends on the economic feasibility of that particular brand. So a mid-scale hotel, lower-scale hotel, you could probably get by 70, 80 rooms. You can see Comfort Inns, Hampton Inns at 80 rooms that are 75 rooms that are still economically feasible. If you're going to a more expensive hotel, the economics won't break even till 100, 150 rooms in our market. Generally speaking, I don't know if you agree with that, Carl.
I would tend to agree with you. It does depend on the hotel chain you're talking about and what their sweet spot is and what the market will bear. But in our case, I think to a degree, given the various zoning classifications, especially with the height, it's highly unlikely you're going to find a flag hotel in a low-scale node district, just because you can't fit enough rooms. So chances are it's going to be a boutique hotel. And like Duncan mentioned, the bottom line is a hospitality use, something that is acceptable in a various zoning district. And in my mind, I don't know why you would allow, retail, but not hotel. And I would just, remind everyone, one of the objectives of this whole exercise is to allow and encourage mixed use, a multiple of uses, creates vibrancy and activity.
I guess I wanted to comment. I wasn't here for the last discussion, so I want to apologize if I'm going over some ground that's already been discussed and resolved, but it seemed to me that David's comment, his initial comment, was a great comment, and that is this question of definition. Certainly, if you take a look at those images and you put a definition or a written definition on what you see there in terms of the scale of them, they're very, very different than even the Riker House, which is a much larger second facility. And the kinds of images you see here may be appropriate in certain locations within commercial districts, and the larger, what's called the branded types, would not be appropriate. So it may be that going forward here, there needs to be accommodations for both types. I say that with some reservations because those images of boutique hotels is something that I'm not aware of any of those that exist in the town now. I'm not any that exist, in the region, but maybe there are. But I guess the bottom line here is that number one, we need a definition, and number two, once we have that definition, it may well be that there's an opportunity to accommodate both of those types within the framework of what we're talking about.
Are we talking, with a bed and breakfast? When people, is that what you're talking about, boutique hotel?
Could be, because some bed and breakfasts are as well as 20, 25 rooms. So it could be a bed and breakfast.
Bed and breakfasts are already accommodated in the zoning code, under different provisions, and not necessarily in commercial districts.
What use category would a bed and breakfast fall under? Its own?
I you asked that question.
Yeah.
Doug, do you have would you be able to help with that?
It allows it in almost every residential district, but you have to go to the zoning board of appeals. There's some strict regulations on that you have to meet. But it's still permitted in almost every residential district, which is, you have to go to the zoning board of appeals.
So that begs the question, should a boutique hotel actually be considered more like a bed and breakfast?
A bed and breakfast is an owner-occupied structure.
In every case.
I think it begs the question, if you're going to allow a bed and breakfast in a residential neighborhood, why wouldn't you allow a boutique hotel in a commercial center?
Right, and if we're supposed to be just doing the commercial areas, and not residential areas.
I think we have to define it anyway, and make it work for it.
Again, I think you have to define boutique hotel however you look at it. You're offering it now as a permitted use. It should be in the definition section so that everyone has a clear understanding of what it is.
Levy, comment on what Doug's already commented on, is that I think if you take a look at a spectrum of accommodations, the bed and breakfast is really something of a scale and of a nature, and the regulations actually try to facilitate this, of a nature that would fit in a residential setting. When you get into those boutique types of hotels, and the full-service hotel, you're talking a very different animal. In most cases, they would not fit well into the fabric of a residential district.
We'll just get back to, I think, Carl's original point. So the question is, if we take a boutique hotel out, and we left it out, and you put a dot, say, just take suburban low-scale node 2.5, and you permitted hotel there. At 2.5, you really can't do a branded hotel. No brand, really, very few brands permit two-story hotels. I shouldn't say none do. You'd probably be limiting yourself to boutique hotel. But if you have concern that even at 2.5 stories, someone might do a branded hotel and you don't want that in that district, then you'd have to come up with a definition of boutique hotel and insert it back into the schedule.
I think I misspoke because it's very clear that we've removed boutique hotel entirely, so we're not permitting it. So,
Dan, repeat what you just said.
I had indicated previously that, it appears that we are permitting a boutique hotel and that we should define it. But if we look at this is clearly an omission or something we're striking out, so we're not permitting boutique hotel at all in this current draft. It's being removed.
That was not my understanding.
Well, it's in red and each circle is in red and stricken through, so.
But if I remember correctly, it was more the terminology that we were eliminating. We were not saying the boutique hotels could not exist.
We were just rolling it into hotel. We're just saying all hotels.
Exactly.
And we talked about the fact that you have corporate office, professional office, but yet we just call it office space. So there's in each category, there's subcategories of office space, subcategories of retail, subcategories of this and that. So we said, why have a subcategory for hotel? It didn't seem to make sense. So at least at the last meeting, we said, let's just eliminate boutique hotel. It's just a subcategory of hotel.
Right.
So then this should be amended to no longer indicate red with a strike-through. We are going, it's just going to be hotel?
The recall decision was made.
Right.
The reason I was bringing it back is because he indicated that he wanted people to understand that he thought there was a difference in the course of conversation.
But I thought that we did understand that, and I thought we had sufficient conversation about exactly this at the last meeting. We decided that we understood what the terminology meant, but we thought it could be blended into hotels, period. We didn't think it needed a subclassification.
But
So-
the use table, the use matrix should just show it in MSN 4, none of the other medium and low scale notes. Just one dot added.
Right, and it does.
Well,
You wouldn't be, guys, you wouldn't be confused if instead of just doing a strike-through, putting in red, we just eliminated it, and you never saw it to begin with, you wouldn't have a question in your mind.
That's what I'm saying.
No, I realize that's not.
It should be indicated now under hotel in the MSN 4 category.
Yeah, we already agreed on that.
Then the question was raised whether or not you would permit, if that's the kind of hotel you're talking about that's included in the category of hotels, can you do something like that that's 12 rooms in the low scale nodes anywhere? I use Swarmsville Station as an example.
It would be permitted. No, it wouldn't be.
No, it wouldn't be permitted,
Only
no.
permitted in the
Right.
higher district.
Yep.
Well, one thing we haven't talked about, unless I missed it at the last meeting, one thing we haven't talked about yet is the difference between what's going to be proposed as a permitted use or a special use permit.
could change. Maybe you allow something with a special use permit if the situation is right, the setting is right, but not permitted by right. Sorry.
No, it's a valid concern, because obviously people are gonna ask for it on the special use. Somebody will ask for something under special use that will be akin to this, so.
But if it's a special use permit, then we have an extra set of criteria to look at, including the setting and situation where it's located.
Right.
Which is essentially what we've been doing for all 68 sites anyway, up to that.
Right. Okay. Any more conversation? Otherwise, we should take a vote on this. At this point, should we leave it as we decided at the last meeting, or do we need to change it? Who's in favor of leaving it as it is, as we decided at the last meeting, please raise your hand. Okay, that answers the question. The majority already said leave it as it is. Thanks to Lee for his concern, but at this point, we're happy with what we decided.
But we're adding the dot at MSN 4.
Yes. Okay, Kim.
And it might be permitted as a special, under special use permit, in a lower scale node. That's something that we discussed later? Okay.
I think we pretty much covered this. The traditional corridor 2.5 was also added per your conversations from last meeting. No, I guess that comes a little bit later. So yeah, the frontages just match what we've already been seeing before, and just gives you a general idea of what would match with those proposed zoning districts. And then it will get, more details as we go forward with the zoning code. Okay, so, if you go to the next page, page 8, so we had this graphic from last meeting, the 3D graphic. A few things were changed with that. We show a step back on the 5-story building, kind of to give people an idea of that. That's not necessarily required in every case, but we just wanted to note that it's an example that people can, kind of think about. And then we kind of put underneath each of these heights, essentially, the districts that may go along with those. So, you have your low scales at your 2.5 and 3, you have your median scales 3 to 4, corridor goes from 2.5 to 5, and then center is 5 to 8. So we kind of wanted to, associate the height with those zoning districts as well. And then, as Duncan mentioned at the last meeting, he kind of said for better understanding of this, the 3D might be a little bit tricky for people to actually relate to the heights. And so we added this graphic to kind of show the 2D version of this. The 65 feet is the tallest current allowable height. And we put in that little table to the left the current zoning districts and their maximum heights. And then kind of showed that versus what we're proposing. So in most cases, the 4, 3.5, 3, and 2.5 are all a height reduction from what's currently allowed in some of the districts, at least GB and SC. And then the 8-story would be the only one that would be allowed to be higher than currently permitted. And I think we've identified 3 areas in the town where that 8 stories could be allowed. So we kind of wanted to show this graphic just to compare the current zoning versus the proposed. So I don't know if anybody has any comments on that.
I just quickly, I think both of these are great additions, and I just would like to note for our notes that of the 13 districts, 9 of them show a reduction in the maximum height.
And from and just another note on that, because for the most part, we're reducing the height, the allowable height level. There are gonna be a number of property owners, who aren't gonna be very happy about that. And especially because it seems to be going in the opposite direction of allowing or encouraging, mixed use and more, dense development.
If I could add to what Carl is suggesting, I went through the draft comp plan, and if we look at, sidetrack, but if we look at the residential section, there's nothing that really drives us to push medium density to mixed use. And I'm hoping we could strengthen that section so that if the planning board is being asked to look at new medium-density residential development, that we have some language in it that gives us more strength to say, look, we don't think this is appropriate. You should go to the new mixed-use areas, because that's where we have supportive services, transportation, pedestrian connectivity, retail opportunities. So I won't belabor that, but that's something I'd like to see strengthened. Yeah, page 3-32 and 3-31. I think it could be changed with simply removing one word on page 3-32 in the second paragraph.
Dan, are you suggesting...
What page are you on? 3-32 of the...
What page are you on? Bottom left-hand corner, page
3-32.
332.
Right.
I have it up here.
3-32. Go ahead, Carol.
Just a clarification, are you suggesting, some kind of language that mandates, mixed use, as opposed to allowing it or encouraging it?
Not necessarily mandate, but something that shows that it's desired.
Top of the page.
Yeah, very top, second paragraph. And it starts off, as with mixed residential category, location criteria for higher density housing include high access corridors served by public transportation, areas near commercial centers and employment concentrations, areas next to educational campuses, and areas near community facilities. New medium residential development should also be focused in designated commercial or mixed-use centers. Properly designed medium-density housing can provide a useful transition between single-family and non-residential. I think this gives us the direction that I would like to see as a planning board member if someone approached the planning board with a rezoning request to a higher density residential. But I'm wondering, can we, remove the word should also and just indicate should be focused in these areas? So, because the whole purpose of this exercise is to push housing in these concentrated areas where services can be found. Yeah. Encourage walkability, encourage that density, so that we don't continue to see senior housing pop up in the middle of no supportive services, for instance. So I'm just thinking, does it make sense just to remove that one word also? I'll let the staff, digest that.
Well, okay, so we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here. We're gonna talk about changes to the amendment in a few moments. So let's take that up in a couple minutes. Let's go through the rest of this if we can. Yeah, Dan won't let us forget.
Duncan, are you happy with these sketches?
Yeah.
Okay. And to Gary's point, when someone points out that we're not getting a reduction, we are getting a reduction, substantial reduction.
I think this will be much easier for the general public to read.
Agreed.
I'm sitting here kind of ruminating over Carl's comment, and I think that property owners will have more education when we deal with the setback provisions as well, because there's some of these areas where they're not going to be able to get height now, and they will not be able to get that additional height under what comes forward here. At least that's the direction it seemed to be headed in. So I think there's more than just this provision which is going to play into the height of the structures that could be on any individual parcel. You have a perplexed look on your...
I'm not sure I'm following you. I mean, I guess I'm reading that the current GB zoning is 65 feet max, and I know some of our properties fall into that have a current GB zoning fall into a suburban medium scale node, which has a max height of 54 feet. So it's more than 10 feet. That's essentially a story, and it makes the feasibility of doing a mixed-use project that much more difficult.
I think that what I was trying to point out, and maybe I was not doing that as effectively as I should, but that there are setback provisions in the code as well which affect how high, even like an on-GB parcel, how high you can go. And actually, some of that, as you go farther into this report, we talk about this building plane that goes up. We have some fairly stringent building plane regulations in the code now which restrict how high structures could be even in the GB zone, even though when you look at just the height restrictions, so you can go up as high as 65 feet. Well, if you take that provision and then interplay it with the setback provisions, you can't get a building that tall. Good.
Yeah, just one change on the frontages, and actually it's not noted in highlighted or red, but it's a fairly simple one. We had urban village green. Suburban was previously labeled suburban village transition, and we thought people may get a little confused with that, so we labeled it strictly suburban. I guess one other change on the graphics here is that we've tried to associate some of the setback distances that correspond to the table in this document on these frontages. So, you know, you have your urban village, which is usually in your traditional low-scale type. So we've put the 0 to 10 setback kind of as an example of what that would be. That's all the changes there were for the frontages. And really there's not any changes from last meeting on the last two pages other than, again, we tried to dimension out on the graphics for the transitions, the 15 versus 25 deep versus shallow lot, for examples.
Karen, the graphic that you have on page 9 under frontages, is that graphic also included in the comprehensive plan amendments?
That's something we're going to talk about later, actually, with the plan amendments, something we're going to bring up.
Well, while I'm holding on to this thing, I have some concerns in regard to if it's going into the comprehensive plan. And Dan and I spoke about this close of business today. I'd have some concern about actually putting those dimensions in.
That's all I have for the zoning document. Is there any other comments, questions, other things we missed, anything like that?
Yeah, so, right, so, well, if folks are pondering and give you a moment without somebody talking, does anybody have any other thoughts on this? The intent with this document is to respond to, well, it's twofold really. One is to set the the guidelines for development of the zoning revisions that Code Studio is going to undertake, and reflect the changes that we have suggested in the comprehensive plan amendment in the regulatory framework that guides the town's development. So this is really intended in part to indicate to Lee and Code Studio, yeah, we're good with these general guidelines, we need to start, we can use these to start to begin to write the code language, specific code language for these districts. The second purpose here, I think, is to respond to one of the questions that we heard when we started the planning board's hearings on the comp plan amendment, which essentially was that a lot of folks wanted to know more about what the comp plan amendments meant in terms of zoning. In other words, they wanted more specific information about what the heights and the other provisions that we're suggesting in here with the different forms and types. They wanted to know how that would play out in zoning. And we hope that this will provide people with a basic understanding about what those things in the comp plan mean and how they might be implemented through zoning. So the intent with this would be to, assuming the committee is okay with it, to release this for public consideration as soon as we can, so folks can begin to dig into this a little bit and understand what the situation is with the zoning. And I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end, but this kind of plays into the schedule over the next month or so, where next week Lee will be, hopefully, available to the planning board at a special meeting they're going to have on Thursday night to introduce the zoning framework to the planning board and generally to the public who might be interested to come and hear about it. That's to give the planning board an idea of what's been going on with the zoning in anticipation of his visit in mid-September, where he will come and be able to present this and probably more detailed information about the zoning code to the planning board and to the general public. He's here for 3 days in the second week of September around the planning board meeting. So what we'd like to be able to do with this is to push it out and make it available for folks that are interested in it to look at and begin to get acquainted with what the zoning would be as it results from the comp plan amendment that's before the planning board now. Gary, does that answer your question?
So the question at this point is, and I have to reiterate what that Dan just said, we need to get this out to the other members of the planning board. There are 3 members of the planning board here tonight, but there are 4 other members that have to look at this document. They have to have a pretty good feeling for it by the time we get to next Thursday's meeting. So are we okay with releasing this at this point? Yeah, right, of course, yeah. So we're okay? I see a general, everybody seems to be shaking their heads, okay. As long as we're on this topic too, because I'll forget about it if I don't say it now. At the meeting next week on August 31st with the planning board, it's also a public meeting. And we would like to have members of the committee attend, because very frankly, when I sit up there and I listen to 12 people tell me we did a lousy job, and at last week's meeting, only one person, Gary stood up and he said, you know what, we worked as hard as we could and we think we did a good job. I'm paraphrasing what you said, Gary, but that's what you essentially said. You know, it would be nice to have more people there who are familiar with the process and understand the discussion that's taken place. Now, it's not the easiest thing in the world to sit through a special meeting. I mean, it could go on for 2-3 hours, who knows? But the fact of the matter is, if you can attend, and if you could be supportive of the actions that we did, we would much appreciate the fact that you were there. So please consider being there. So we're okay now with this to go forward. Yeah.
I'll just add to Dale's point, and again, I'll talk about this a little bit when we get to the item on the agenda, but if it encourages you at all to attend next week, we're going to try and break next week up into, here's Lee telling us about what this means in terms of zoning, and then allow people to see some diagrams that staff has started to put together that analyzes the zoning a little bit, which Lori will describe in a moment or two, and kind of have an open house format within the council chambers and out in the hallway, so folks can come and look at the maps and maybe talk individually about what they see and what comments they might have about it. So it always helps to have somebody from the committee there, a couple people available that might go out in the hallway and with staff and be able to talk to folks that have questions about things to the extent that you're comfortable in doing. I mentioned a moment ago that Lori was going to talk a little bit about a zoning analysis that the staff has been working on over the course of the last several weeks. The intent here was to try and drill down a little bit on the map in the comprehensive plan, the designations that you've made in terms of the center types, the provisions that are outlined in the assessment and the framework here, and then to try and understand what the implications might be for the commercially zoned properties within those centers that would result from the changes that are being proposed here. We haven't finished that analysis completely, but we wanted to have Lori give you a little idea of what they've been working on and what the form of that might take and what the findings are starting to indicate.
You got a couple? Okay. So, Kim did a great job creating zoom-in maps to all 72 nodes and centers and corridors, and I think we spent 3 or 4 days going through them as part of a preliminary analysis, and really it was a test run of the zoning framework that you saw tonight, basically looking at our whole toolkit of options and seeing how they might apply to each of the districts. So when we looked at each individual map, we paid attention to the district designation. We looked at what was there now in terms of height and setback. We looked at what was the relationship to the neighboring properties, especially residential properties, and the overall neighborhood context. We also did a really preliminary historic resources review, and we paid attention to other site features like vegetative buffers, where there's really large lots, what's on the opposite streetscape, what the corridor leading into it looks like. So we did this initial test run, and I'll talk a little bit about what we found. But I do want to point out that we only really focused on the parcels whose underlying zoning will be changed. So that's GB, NB, SC, TNB, and LW. And in some of the nodes, we're not going to show you all the maps, but in some of the nodes, that was only a few properties. In others, it was the entire node, but it really depends on. But when we did this analysis, we did it in a way that we looked at the properties that were going to be going to have changes in their zoning. So what we tried to gauge really when we looked at each individual map was what frontages and transitions might make sense for that area. And then we looked again at other possible tools, so like where we might apply block standards, where it makes sense to have upper story setbacks, both on the frontages or maybe to the rear of the property where it butts residential. And what we wanted to identify by going through all of these was, do the framework options really work or fit? Are there any issues we're creating with nonconformities, with heights and setbacks? And where we should consider, again, other tools like the step backs, internal streets, and block standards that might not necessarily be drilled down in the framework, but something we could add in later on with the zoning code detail. So this is just kind of an example map to show you what we were looking at. So the yellow dashed boundary is the center boundary, and as you can see the highlighted parcels in the middle, those are the ones whose underlying zoning would be affected. In this particular case, it was really easy to see that this would probably remain either a suburban frontage or a green frontage on both Sheridan and Hopkins. And then we also identified where, you have some shallow lots, so it's pretty clear to see that shallow lot transition abutting residential made sense in the northern part of this corridor. And then in the bottom half, you have some more intense land uses where you might not need such an intense transition. And then we also identified areas where, I think, on the western lots there, where you have kind of a little bit of green space and vegetation in the back of those parking lots to the abutting residential, where you might want to advocate for maintaining existing vegetation. So we called all of these things out and kind of did this center by center, node by node, looking at how this fits with what the framework says. And so the findings we have here are that the toolkit that we have prepared of our various district designations really do work. We didn't, Kim and I looked at areas where do we want another district designation that we don't already have, and we didn't really find that. We saw that the options for our frontages and transitions seemed to be sufficient. There wasn't really a frontage that we were missing. As far as nonconformities go, we did identify again and again where there would be setback and height nonconformities, particularly churches. They came up, they're gonna be a nonconformity. But the way we have our nonconformity outlined in our zoning code right now is if you're not expanding the extent of that nonconformity, that you can continue to maintain that development as is. And even if you do add on to a building, if you're not expanding the amount of the setback, making the setback worse, or like deeper if we want a urban village frontage, then you're okay to proceed. And Doug can correct me if I'm wrong. So the other thing too, on the district designations, we also have tools that work for historic clusters. There was only really, we have a few historic properties that are in some of these districts, but it's really a non-issue. With Swarmville, Port of Entry, and Eggert Bailey, that's where your clusters were, but the form codes that we're providing in the underlying district designation really fit better with those historic buildings, their heights, and where they sit on the lot. So it's actually going to be better for these districts than current GB zoning. And then the last thing is that we did pick out a couple minor clarifications that are needed, and some of these include changes to center boundaries or possibly splitting centers or districts, and I'm not going to go into details on that because that's part of what Kim and Dan are going to talk about. But if you have any questions on kind of what we've gone through, let me know.
Just something that popped out with the Port of Entry. I think the town board is going to be having some public hearings because of the Historic Preservation Commission. I think the Getzel Port of Entry is one of them. Is what we're doing here going to impact the public hearings that are already scheduled?
This shouldn't impact the public hearing. I think that's a public hearing to set up a historic district. Is that right? Yeah.
So this wouldn't impact?
This wouldn't impact the establishment of a historic district.
As this analysis is completed, we'll be using this information to help us when we get to the point of becoming very specific on a proposed zoning map. So we've got a comp plan map that outlines, the types of centers. We've got maps that begin to identify the specific districts that you've identified in the framework. This analysis will be very useful when we get to the point where we're putting the map together and trying to understand what some of the differences are, even within the centers. So, Kim will talk a little bit more about the areas that Lori alluded to, where through the analysis they found there might be some areas that we want to consider as a committee before we finalize those designations. Any questions on this? Any comments, thoughts, anything that you think we might be missing? Carl, looks like you're ready.
I don't know why this just popped into my head, but are we looking at any changes to parking requirements for mixed-use projects, given the shared arrangement that you find in mixed-use developments?
I don't know, Doug, if you might have some comments, but the zoning code currently has provisions in it for shared arrangements for parking. You currently have that ability with the current code, and it takes into consideration things like the availability of public transit and institutional uses that are not in use during normal business hours. In addition, there's a provision in there, and I'm not even, I think maybe you've used that in the past, but I'm not sure of that, whereby you can essentially do an alternate parking plan, which allows you to provide a plan to the Commissioner of Buildings that really specifies for your particular use of that property what the parking demand is going to be, and that has to be based upon some objective study. And you can do that, and once that parking plan is put in place, then that's what's used when we get to the point where we're doing a site plan for the site. So some of that's already in the code, and I think that as we move forward, and it may be later in this process, I'm assuming it might be much later in the process, we take another look at that.
I think it makes sense, because under the current ordinance, where that provision is available, you have the ability to do that. I think where we're headed here, it would happen so much more frequently that the commissioner would end up receiving many of those alternate shared parking analyses and have to make a lot of decisions versus kind of finding a way to embed it within the ordinance, if you're really doing a lot more mixed use and shared parking is occurring. It's happening less frequently now because you have more single-use properties, so it's not happening as often. It doesn't come up as frequently.
David, I hear you saying that the provisions are in there, but basically the precedent mixed use, we're going to see more and more of the alternate parking places.
I would think so, because in order to make the numbers work on the mixed use, the densities on the sites will get bigger, and the way you'll justify that from the developer's perspective is, well, I've got these complementary uses, I don't need all this redundant parking, so I'll have to do that alternate shared parking analysis to make my project make sense, which forces that all on the building commissioner. If you saw one a year, he'll see a dozen a year now.
But it's better to do it administratively through the building department than have to bring either a variance to the ZBA or
I agree,
something.
I agree, and I'm not suggesting the village is the way to go, but the village, when it went to its form-based zoning, basically eliminated its parking requirements. So that's the other extreme.
It's swinging pretty far.
Yes, that's the other extreme. I'm not suggesting that as the solution, but that, once again, doing the alternate parking analysis, additional exercise you go through, you gotta bring your engineer in, you gotta go through the analysis with that, then you gotta go sit down with either Doug or the commissioner, go through it all. It's very subjective, and, depending on the project and the people involved, it's just not as predictable. It's a lot easier in the village, but I'm saying that that's maybe a more of an extreme.
If you do it through the alternative parking plan, it's not a discretionary approval, it has to go to the planning board or the ZBA. Just seems like a better way to do it, unless it can get folded into the new code.
Yeah, I agree with you, yes. What I'm saying is, if you can fold something into the new code that is built in, I don't know what the formula is, but built in the element of shared parking. So it basically reduces the parking standards, so it becomes as of right. That would be the ideal scenario, while still maintaining the right to do some alternate study if there's some special circumstances. In the absence of anything, what Rick pointed out is that there is a mechanism there, but it does require that extra step, and that may become more frequently used as you move towards more mixed-use projects.
That's an interesting concept, which is not part of what we have in the code now. But the one thing I did want to point out is that the way the provisions are written now, they're really more in terms of a horizontal mix of uses, where you have one building next to another building. It doesn't really deal effectively, from my point of view, when you have stratification, where you have commercial on the first floor, office on the second, and third, fourth, and fifth are residential uses. I don't think that is adequately addressed in the current code, and that's something we should take a look at.
David, I'm not familiar with the village's code. Do they simply mandate a alternative analysis or a mixed-use analysis for parking? And you take that?
No, actually, I'm not an expert in it either, but as I recall, the parking requirements are very, very modest. And they're there, but they're very, very minimalistic. And I think, I don't want to speak for Brian or the trustees, but I think the intent was that, generally speaking, you're in the village, they're encouraging walkability, they're encouraging other kinds of things, but at the same context, they also kind of recognize that most developers aren't going to do a project that is not going that the failure to have enough parking is going to cause the project to fail. So it just is counterintuitive. Like, why would I do a project, even if I had all the freedom in the world, with no parking, if it's a project that requires parking? I would just be committing economic suicide by doing that. So I think there's some of that built into that, is that, okay, it's self-regulating, yes, in some respects, yes, good way of saying it.
Didn't the Urban Land Institute put out a matrix for determining mixed parking? I mean, maybe we should study the option that you're suggesting, that if it's in a mixed-use center particularly, that...
Well, I know that traffic engineers
parking
have
should be
those, yeah,
determined.
because the traffic engineers that do the shared studies, they have all of the ULI studies, the other studies that they access in order to do the shared parking analyses. So I'm guessing that's where a lot of it comes from. I'm just not an expert at it, I just know what they use.
I mean, just to offer some
Yeah.
flexibility, if it's in the center,
We-
maybe that should be the
Right.
standard for parking, for instance.
We know that parking is an issue that needs to be covered in the work that we're doing. We just need to pound home to Lee that that's something we need to consider and maybe get spun up on a little bit. We're a lot. Let me, go to the next item on the agenda, which essentially is, kind of a review of the changes that the committee has come up with for the comp plan amendment over the last couple of months. Over time, this group has decided there may be some changes that you want to make to the original amendment that you endorsed back in May. The amendment is before the planning board. We've been opening the hearing for people to come and comment on it. We've gotten some comments, some substantive, some maybe not as substantive, more on process and whatnot. As I mentioned earlier, we'd like to think that by providing some idea of what the code provisions may look like will allay some of the concerns that folks had about how this amendment will translate into zoning. But over the course of the last couple of months, as this group has met, there were some changes that were suggested, voted on, and I think what I'd like to do tonight is just confirm those with you, and what we'll do from there, assuming we've captured what those changes are here, we will make a set of changes to the comp plan amendment that will be before the planning board, and propose amendments to the amendment, if you will, before the planning board actually acts to adopt these. So I'm going to go through some of these, and then Kim's going to go through some of the ones that Lori alluded to a moment ago that they identified through their analysis. Those are changes that you have not considered in the past. But we had several changes in center designations. I'm just going to identify those, and I don't know if we have the map.
I do, and I have it revised.
Yeah, so let's take a little walk through these. There's 5 of them. And hopefully you'll recall them. And the first 2 are the Sheridan and Harlem Road intersection. And what we had originally designated for those areas, for the east side of Harlem and Sheridan, I don't know if we're down there, so you want to can you use the mouse and just show folks where that is? Yeah. So it's those 2 on the southeast corner, southwest corner of the intersection of the 290 and Sheridan Drive, if you will, 21 and 22. So on the east side, it had been designated as traditional, and we indicated that we wanted to change that to suburban. And on the west side, that went from traditional to suburban as well. I don't know if you recall that conversation, but those would be 2 changes that were made to the map, and would be changed in the designation of the comp plan map, figure 6A. Bailey Avenue in Grover, Cleveland was changed from a low-scale node to a corridor, and that would be number 27, right? 26 and 20, okay. Okay, everybody tracking on that one? Transit in Norrisport, so we gotta go all the way to the other end of the town. Yeah. Transit in Norrisport went from medium-scale node to a corridor. Again, everyone recall that conversation? That one would change. And then Gettsville Plaza went from a medium-scale node to a low-scale node. And that's number 61. Everybody recall those changes, and, okay, so we're good to go with those. I don't know if it was Dan or Gary, I think it was Dan that wrote, not too long ago, about a comment that was on map figure 6A in the current amendment, which talked about, centers which were shown to transform, on that map. And I think the recommendation or the discussion was to remove that comment, from the map. And so we would, follow through with that. There's a note, you probably can't see it.
There was a note.
There was a note, it's gone, it's gone. So if you didn't want it gone, I guess, but, is that consistent with what folks' recollection is for that?
My question was, what are the transformation areas?
Well, and we had conversations about that, and I think in the end, it's probably not necessary to have that notation there. So, it's being removed. The heights for the four types for the types, you had talked about changing both in the text and in the graphics. So, essentially what happened is, for the low scale node, well, for all of these I mentioned, instead of a range of 2 to 5 or whatever, all these are going to start at 1. So the designations of these will all start at 1. And the low scale node, which was once would be 1 to 3, is now 1 to 2.5, which we talked about earlier. The medium scale node is now 1 to 4. Corridor is now 1 to 5, and centers are now 1 to 8. So if you remember that diagram that's in the comp plan, this one, those designations would change, as I just mentioned. Again, I think that's consistent with what the committee has said, and I know Ramona wanted to ensure that we indicate that it's from 1 story up in those designations. In the comp plan amendment, there's a series of graphics that are meant to depict examples of each one of the 4 types. As I indicated earlier, I just wanted to affirm this with you. Those drawings, which you do have them, okay, which look like this, and again, they're intended to exemplify what these types of areas might look like. I will remind you that it's Lee's intent to have these same diagrams, or something similar to this, in the zoning code as well. But in the plan, these are intended to illustrate what these areas might look like, to show the differing scales and the different types of development that might occur within each area. These are generic. When we get to the final version of the plan, it's their intent to draft examples that are specific to Amherst with specific examples that would probably be more illustrative of the town itself. So I'll just remind you that those will be replaced. The next item Rick alluded to a moment ago, and it deals with adding language in the comp plan about the different types of frontages. And you'll recall the diagram that Kim showed us a few moments ago that showed the different types of frontages here. I don't know that the committee has discussed these in the past. As staff, we talked a little bit about it. I think what we're really looking for is perhaps some guidance as to whether or not these should be introduced in the plan. I think it's our feeling that they probably should not. And one of the challenges we have over the next couple of months as we go forward with the comp plan amendment consideration, and then as we bring along these zoning considerations, is that we begin to blur the lines between zoning and the plan. And we want to be sure that we're not codifying, if you will, the plan, that the code is the regulations and the implementation rules, if you will, and the plan is meant to be a conceptual and a guideline to the types of development that occur in the town. That's a risk that we run by doing these processes together. But that's where we're at, and so I guess we wanted to throw it out to the committee. Do you feel as if this is something that needs to be in the plan? And again, we would probably advise against it, but talking to the consultant and talking amongst ourselves, we weren't quite sure, whether we should, leave it out or put them in.
What are your reasons for saying that this should not be included?
Primarily because again, they're somewhat prescriptive, okay? We're basically saying that these types should go with this type of development, this type of node or corridor should have specifically this kind of frontage, and in some cases, when we get to the map, and Kim will talk about this a little later, it's not a universal application of these frontages across the board. Low-scale nodes might not always have village, whatever the village center or whatever, may not have that type of frontage, and we want to leave the flexibility for that to the code and not prescribe it in the plan.
Can we have the photographs and the narrative without? Can we have the photographs and the narrative without the sketches and distances?
I think you can have what you want.
Would it alleviate the staff concern?
I think our feeling is that we probably don't bother to put them in because it's going to vary so much. Yeah. So I think the answer to your question is you can probably have it. I'm just not sure that we would recommend that. I don't know. Rick, you have something to add?
Early in the meeting, I commented on this, and my concern is primarily that it had some dimensions on it. I think dimensions certainly needs to come off. I think in the plan, speaking to the issue of different types of frontages is something which may be useful. I understand that there's a difference of opinion, I guess, on the staff, so I'm going to defer to what the committee's position is on this. But just to reiterate what I just said, is that I do feel very strongly that the dimensions, if this goes in, they should go in without dimensions.
I also think it's important to note in the document that it is not intended to be prescriptive, and that it should have flexibility on a case-by-case basis. Somehow build that into the copy of the document so there's clear intent.
I think that might be basically a good compromise if we use these images as a way of showing what options there might be, but not necessarily applying any given frontage to any given center designation. That might be a way of dealing with it.
Are those called framework, or what is the section title there? Frontage guidelines or something like that.
I think as long as the dimensions are given as a minimum maximum, from one to the other, it gives people an idea of what can go in there, rather than not listing any dimension at all.
Just adding to that, I think having a visual image of what these frontages with the green space and the trees, I think that's a positive.
I agree. I agree with Rick as well, as to remove the dimensions. I think, going along with Carl, I think it's important to indicate that these are for illustrative purposes in the plan, because there's some other variables that will impact what the desired frontage might be, particularly the width of the road. We might want to further define the road by pulling the frontages towards the road to decrease its width. So,
I guess the other question, though, is if we don't put this in here, do we open a can of worms and people are going to ask the question? Yeah, but the code will be verbal. Right. And Well, then that would be fine too. I mean, if somewhere it were included, I don't care, I don't think we particularly care where it is. But I think you need an illustration to show potentially what could occur, so that people have an idea, because otherwise, there are gonna be many questions saying, well, what's it gonna look like? Give me an example of what it's gonna look like. And again, if it's suggested, but it's not mandated, you're taking some of the sting away. We suggest that that's what it would look like, but it's gonna change depending upon each individual circumstance.
Yeah, I think, Al, you really hit it right there, because part of this is gonna come down to the person doing the planning. What can they put on the site and how can they put it on? We're giving suggestions. We'd like to see this type of frontage. Then they develop it, and it then gives the planning board an opportunity to say, you fit within the guideline that we have. It's something that you've got parking in front, whether it's one row or two rows, that'll depend on the site. So I think just these illustrations has been recommended without the dimensions, gives everybody the opportunity to follow the general guidelines based on what they can put on the particular site.
General guidelines based on what the developer feels is necessary to complete the project. Oh, the planner, right, exactly. Yeah.
If I can, let's hold off on this discussion for a minute. Just hold still. I'm gonna ask Kim to go through the bottom part of the changes that she's talking about, and I think maybe by walking through that, you'll get a sense of what the concern is that we have as a staff, because essentially what we're talking about here is assigning a specific type of frontage to a specific combination of form and type, and that is a level of detail that we think we generally like to avoid in the plan. It's not to say that it won't be in the code, but it may be too detailed for the plan, and maybe if we walk through a couple of these, it'll exemplify that.
I'm not sure exactly how these fit into the frontages really per se, but maybe it'll give you a little bit more guidance. So there was just a few things we wanted to clarify based on conversations from last meeting, and I'll try to go through these. So if you, one of them, this one was not part of your discussion, but it was something that came out of the analysis that Lori and I had done. So there's the Walmart on Sheridan. I'll try to bring this up just basically in the map. So this is here in 13 and 18. So we looked at these two, and you know, one is a center, 13 is a center, and 18 is a corridor. As we were going through this, there's a portion in 13 here on the south side of Sheridan Drive that we feel should be removed from the center and added to this corridor category. So essentially, this portion on the south side of Sheridan Drive, just here, would be a part of this center instead. Because it pretty much has the same depth of parcels, smaller buildings, smaller parcels. If I can see if I can bring it up in Google, just so you can see a little bit better. So here between Millersport is here, Bailey is here. Sweet Home is here. So this is the corridor portion that we already have, Center 18, and we suggest that adding this section here to this corridor. So that's just something we kind of noticed, you know, if the center is Suburban Center 5, you wouldn't really want 5 stories here. And maybe that's not even feasible. So that's just one suggestion we had. The second is where Northtown Auto is, on Sheridan Drive. Again, I'll pull this up for you. Here. So at the last meeting, the committee had discussed zoning this portion that is west of Gettsville Road, Suburban Center 5, and this portion east, Suburban Center 8. And I just wanted to clarify with the committee, right now, both of these, if we had this one here and this one here, would be a suburban center, but it would have two different zoning districts. So I wanted to clarify that we're not splitting this up into two centers, but we're just going to have two zoning districts within one center. So we're not changing the category of this. This wouldn't become a suburban corridor. This wouldn't become suburban corridor. They're both suburban center, one large center with two different zoning districts within. Is that correct? I just wanted to make sure. Okay. That was just one clarification. And then right near this, the Sheridan and Sunrise area on the other side of this here. So this is kind of the center here. It includes Basil and, you know, the hotel here. So at the last meeting, Lee had suggested that this portion on the south side of Sheridan with Basil become not part of the suburban center 5. He said because it's near the residential, it's a smaller parcel, that it be lowered to 3. So the issue with that, just a little bit, is if you go back to our district table here. So if we wanted to classify this to be 3 stories and not 5, currently we don't have a center category with 3 stories. So we would have to classify that as a suburban corridor 3. So I just wanted to make sure that we're okay with splitting this up. The north side would still be the suburban center 5. It'll end soon. So the north portion would be suburban center 5 as we had already designated it. And then we break this section off down here as a small suburban corridor 3. Okay. Good.
I mean, 5 stories, those are single-family homes right next door, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This is kind of high.
Well, this here on the south side would be broken off to suburban corridor 3.
Yeah, I'm talking about...
Oh, this one?
Well, Marriott's already...
So as part of the analysis that Lori and I did, obviously we looked at this center, and we sort of made a note to say the 5 stories should be concentrated along the thruway, kind of as a note to designate for this specific center. I mean, but the committee is free to, you know, change that to 3. Again, there's no suburban center 3, so it would have to go to a different designation in the plan, either corridor or something else, if the committee did that.
But not no.
No. I just want to point out, this is kind of what I'm talking about. Your comp plan map is very general. It says that this is a center, you know, just a center, basically. To begin to try and describe frontage types to these, and you can kind of see the differences that occur just within those centers themselves, I think it would be a challenge. And that's why I think having the palette of frontages that might be available and associating them with the districts and the code is a good thing to do. I'm just not sure that assigning them in the plan is a good idea. Now, if we want to go back and talk about introducing the idea of frontage in the plan and how they might be more contextually sensitive, that I think that would be all right. But to have these specifically associated with even the form and type combinations, I think is a challenge.
Dan, I kind of agree with you, but we're talking about 2 elements now. We're talking about the palette of different frontages, and we're talking about associating that palette with various types and forms. I think what I was advocating for was just to basically provide within the plan, that palette, but don't put the association in there.
And in the analysis, you know, when we looked at this, we identified where I think Dan is talking about where you can drill down in the actual code language drafting, is that your frontage could be the thruway, and that's where your height could be located, and you can address the other concerns on the residential side with the deep lot transition plus step backs along that edge. So you can really push the height and higher intensity form away from the residential. You have the room to do that in a lot like this.
The plan primarily is focused on land use. And this is, add the frontage is talking about the controls, the regulations, like bulk control. So it makes sense not to include it, especially if it's already in the framework for the zoning and it's going to get developed farther for the zoning. If we keep some of the illustrations for the zoning, I think you still serve the purpose by taking it out of the plan and adding it to the zoning.
I was just gonna support what Gary was saying. I think, in the plan, we're really limiting our description to form of development, the three forms. I don't know if it makes sense to put this in the plan.
There's just two more, I believe. Oh, we confirm this. So the north would be the suburban center 5, like we had said before. Again, Lori and I noted some comments on that, where we would want step backs for where the height should be located. And then this south side, the basal essentially, would be broken off and put into a different designation, suburban corridor 3. So the height is reduced there.
All okay with that?
Okay.
The alternative would be medium scale node 4, 3 or 4. We have
Here.
Yeah, it's pretty good sized parcel, but second bullet,
Yeah. The corridor is suggesting we limit it to 3 stories, which is probably more palatable to the surrounding residential uses. Never?
What do we want to do?
Take that suggestion.
Take that suggestion. We all agree with that? Yeah, we got it.
Okay. Let's see. So, same area here, just moving over a little bit. So at the last meeting, Lee, currently the south side of Sheridan Drive here is a suburban corridor 5. So what Lee had suggested last time was to kind of essentially take this parcel, which is much shallower, and break it out as a separate thing like suburban corridor 3. What Lori and I went through with the analysis is that this side of Sheridan, from about here to here, is kind of the same as this, and it has the adjacent residential area. We thought maybe instead of breaking it up, 5 here, 3 here, 5 here, that the whole thing should be suburban corridor 3. That's just a suggestion that we found from our analysis, and we wanted to ask the committee about what they thought about that.
Where's the residential? That makes sense. Everybody okay with reducing that to 3?
I can't see a 5-story building like self-storage.
Probably not. Yeah. Okay, so
Okay.
we're agreeable with what you want to do.
Okay, suburban corridor 3, that whole section. Okay.
Good job, guys.
2 more. They're hopefully not so bad. Almost. So Eggertsville on the north side. So this is just, the church, the Key Bank. Currently you have it designated as traditional medium scale 3. We were just through the analysis thinking because this site is so large, it could accommodate the next one up for traditional medium scale 3.5. And that would include, the residential type of character to the roof. And again, just something we noticed through our analysis, Not sure if you want to bump that up to the 3.5. Keep it at 3 is perfectly fine, but just something we wanted to ask what your thoughts were on.
What's the advantage of changing to 3.5? Yeah, to enhance project feasibility.
Yeah, it gives it that extra 12 feet. Plus, when you have the half-story, I guess it advocates more for residential-type roofs rather than the flat roof that you have at the Key Bank.
Yeah, here are 3 in front of
And you have the height there already surrounding it with Sacred Heart and the St. Benedict's. The height is pretty much there.
Certainly with the price, we can build that up. How do we feel about that? Do we think we should go to 3.5? Yes. Okay. Just on that corner, right?
Just on the north side, nothing on the south side. And again, we're only looking at the GB and, commercially zoned parcels, so it wouldn't be the Sacred Heart and it wouldn't be the church or anything like that. Last one is Hopkins and Dodge. So we've talked about this one already a little bit here. So this is near Williamsville North High School across the street. So at the last meeting, again, I just wanted to make sure, this currently is one center here. We had talked about this being a low-scale node 2.5, and this swim school area, because there's not quite adjacent residential as much as here, to allow this to be 3, suburban, medium, low-scale 3. Again, I just wanted to make sure we're keeping the center as suburban low-scale, but we're allowing the 2 different zoning districts with the 2.5 versus the 3. Okay, just making sure, because I didn't know if you wanted to split them into 2 different centers, but they're classified as the same thing with a different height, essentially. Okay.
Now you're done?
No, that is it, unless anybody else has any other comments.
You made several changes.
How many changes did we make altogether? Okay, we made 6 changes. We're all okay with the changes that we made?
Yes.
Everybody's shaking their head affirmatively, that I can see. Nobody's negative. Okay. All right.
So, given the last conversation about frontage, again, I just want to close the door on that one. We may talk about frontage type, we're not gonna illustrate in the comp plan, and we'll talk a little bit about internally as to how that might play out in the document itself. Is that agreeable, folks?
It's in this document, right?
It is, yes.
Which I think people are gonna read this more so than they're gonna read
Plan.
chapters 3 and chapters 10 in the comp plan. This is more concise, really. Start over?
No.
That's okay, you're fine. Okay, we're all okay? All right. Yes. Yeah, because people need to see it. Yeah, right.
Would you rather leave it out of the plan entirely?
I would.
If that's the case, then we won't bother with it, that's fine.
Right.
The frontage concepts, yes. So we'll leave it out, we won't even go there with it, that's fine. Got it. Okay. Okay, so just to summarize what I said earlier this evening, the changes that we just talked about are changes that will be made to the amendment that's been under consideration by the planning board. We'll make those changes. The zoning framework will be finalized, and both those documents will be put up on the website as soon as we can get them on there, and make them available for next week's planning board meeting and then subsequent meetings beyond that. Just to review the schedule in the near future, again, the planning board has a special meeting on the 31st to hear about the code. There is a joint committee meeting on September 13th, where we'll talk some more about the zoning. Hopefully we'll have some more specific language that's Code Studio's been working on. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Lee will be in town on the 13th, 14th, and 15th, so Lee will be able to talk a little bit about the code with you at your joint committee meeting. You'll be able to talk with him about questions you had along the way and kind of affirm some of the, maybe some of the things we've talked about. And, the planning board will continue their hearing on the plan amendment on the 14th, and then we'll have an information session on the zoning by Lee on the 14th. So, I know nobody's got anything to do on the 13th and 14th of September, so they can come right out and have meetings on subsequent nights. That'd be great.
You know, not for public dissemination, but at this point, you guys on the 13th and 14th get paid for it, the rest of us don't. Yeah, well, that's true, you shouldn't be either, too. I want to go back again just one more time. On the public information meeting on the 31st, rather, next week, if you could attend, please do. We could use as much support as we can get. The one thing I failed to mention, when Gary was making his comments at the last planning board meeting, someone in the middle of his comments said that it wasn't true what he was saying. And that's what happens. People come to one meeting, they get a perception at one meeting, they don't know about the other 32 meetings that we've gone through and how we've discussed all this. So there is strength in numbers, so if you can come out and you can lend your support, even if you just get up and you speak for 2 minutes, you can only speak for 3 anyhow. But it would be great, okay, to have people that would say positively, we worked on this, we put a lot of effort into it, you may not agree with all of it, but it's the best that we come up with at this point. Because very frankly, that's what it's been. It's been a compromise on everybody's part, which has really been great. And I have to commend you guys, because the more I get into this, the more I listen to you, it's absolutely amazing to me how we have all grown, including myself, and learned a lot from this process, too. So thank you very much for your attention in doing this. Are we done now for tonight?
Before we adjourn, I'm just wondering if, before the final amendments are made to the comp plan, you suggested that I remind you again about my thoughts on 3-32. I was also looking at the focal planning areas, the illustrations. Do you think it's necessary that the staff evaluate those, if there's any need to amend those for continuity with anything in the plan or anything that might change those? I looked at the one Snyder focal planning area concept plan. It still references reconfigure Harlan-Kensington intersection, provide open space and streetscape improvements. I'm assuming that was a note prior to the double roundabout being introduced. So I'm just wondering, maybe for continuity, if staff could just look at those illustrations, each focal planning area, to see if it's consistent with what we're proposing. And then again, I just want to reiterate, whatever you can do to give the planning board some strength to encourage medium-density residential in these new mixed-use areas.
You want to use the mic? You didn't use the microphone.
What did I say?
I have no idea.
I think it's perfectly appropriate for the staff to take a look at the focal planning areas and suggest whatever changes are necessary to make them consistent with whatever else we're changing in the plan.
Thank you. Close enough. Okay, public. We drove the 2 gentlemen that were here out. I guess they get tired of listening to us, so we have no public tonight this evening. Again, thank you very much, and we'll see you next month.